de agosto hay un seminario. Yo estoy allí representando el Instituto de esa fundación. Se va a trabajar el tema de adaptación climática. Una referencia. Sí, le voy a... nosotros vamos a
How many cups are we going to need? Glasses?
Okay.
5?
clase.
Same as last time? 4. Okay.
When you decide.
Vamos a agarrar esto.
Yeah, yeah. Right, right.
That the Wi-Fi works.
Yeah,
that I see.
yeah.
And I would just hate to
Yeah.
she's
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right, but thank you for doing
No.
And then nice of you to get it. Not her fault, you know.
Anyway, I was like,
Yeah.
it's still, I was like, until she said it, I was like running really behind.
And Benjamin's okay. Yeah. But it's also, it's also I just please try and find if he wants. But we could also put him on, still to be with us because I could talk to Lauren. Lauren could fill in.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
one benefit of her having, she
Yeah.
has no
Yeah.
to do.
So, to be determined. I mean,
Yeah, and I
we
think-
don't have to do that. But,
Yeah.
I was thinking, I don't know if he wants to still have it for tomorrow. I mean, if I can, that's what I do. If that's your is. Because, suppose you go down there and suppose we tell him not to something. But it's sort of, I
White House.
understand.
How do we describe this place, which is a gem and unique in Washington?
Yeah, yeah.
But,
All right.
but yeah, so he's
It was
you see, I got that ball.
we gotta get more money. What door? Oh, I understand.
Sí, bueno, nosotros tenemos venimos trabajando ya en cuatro actividades que vamos a hacer y ya tenemos el plan de trabajo todo, pero tenemos que, yo también estoy viendo quiénes nos van a poder colaborar allá. Entonces, quería saber. Sí, no, pero How are you doing? Good.
Here we go off you're speaking and it's not what you think. Oh, you're right there. I was just speaking with you. Oh, okay. And I'm on our various. I'm so sad. Hi, how are you?
Come in and she has the presentation, so I at the end we have to stretch a little bit. But it's going into lunch. There we go.
Yeah, not really good at that out here. But when it was usually years in advance. I'll make sure I get a copy. I'll make sure I get a copy for you.
Good. I mean, and I can think. How do you want to, for example, well, of course, obviously, with some,
Like you said, when you get thrown, if you're up there, you're
put too many deep questions on Lisa's bit. But with the other two, maybe 3 questions each from the, and now that we know that they're probably going to be a yes, each one, do we know if Mr. Gallo is going to be speaking Espanol? Okay. Okay, but it looks like it's mostly
I'm going to close it.
understand it. Okay. Because obviously some of the presentation in Spanish and also
Oh, yeah. Without, there's no help. I see nothing but especially.
okay. Now, Mr. Arellano, is he going to have for questions? Because I don't know. A lot of people understand Spanish.
Yeah, I'm really
Excellent.
and the gravity is good. It's happening.
Well, I think we're in good shape. When do we, I think we're already in good shape. So probably in 10 minutes.
Okay, so who's getting copies? Make sure I've got it.
So,
So we've got Sally.
okay, so I'll be sending
And Cindy, do you have slides?
No.
Okay. No. So, and then for Cindy, it's got a video. Okay. But you'll like cue us up for the video, right?
Yeah, I'll mention if I'm going to show the video in my remarks, but probably not at
Not
this point.
totally. There's plenty on time, right?
Yeah, if we're running.
Fill out.
Yeah, there she goes.
Who's who's going first?
Yeah.
I know I will be starting on Monday. Yesterday was the consultant. So I had task on outlining yesterday we had a team meeting to
Well, I guess
taking any time off this summer?
I am. I am taking like the last week of August or something. I'm going to Alaska.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've never been.
It's stunning. I went years ago, and I don't like to repeat. But it was stunning, and one of the Sims friends is going, and another one's birthday falls around then.
Are you like an outdoors type? Are you like fishing and hunting?
Not fishing or hunting, but looking at bears will
Yeah,
be
okay.
really cool. Like,
Without
you know,
shooting? And
yes.
taking their pictures?
Yes, as they're catching salmon, that sounds really cool. Yeah. And you said you don't have anything planned yet?
Probably a hat or it's just the outer banks.
Okay, oh, but that's so beautiful.
Yeah,
It is.
It is.
The bioluminescence that comes in too. I mean, it's
Señor Arellano, mucho gusto.
Vas a moderar.
Soy Steve Wilson.
Usted va a moderar.
Sí, sí.
Mucho gusto. Yo,
Soy con el PID acá en Washington.
Mucho gusto, Steve.
Sí, mucho gusto.
Lunch is 12:45. So
12:45.
basically, we can go to 12:50 and then the next and I will do the briefing to you.
Okay, and then I'm supposed to also announce that they go downstairs and it's at 12:45 to drop off their headsets and that the keynote is in English. Señor Arellano, ¿tiene los audiofonos por traducción?
Sí, 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 sí. Sí.
No sé si la mayoría de la
Sí,
audiencia habla en
sí.
español.
Tienen.
Es una mezcla, ¿no?
Es una mezcla, sí, pero yo prefiero hablar en
No,
español.
no
Es
problema.
más fluido.
Entiendo.
Sí, pero para las preguntas sí
Sí, es mejor.
es mejor tenerlo puesto.
Perfecto.
Am I allowed to throw my coffee up here?
Yes, of course. You are allowed to do anything as a speaker.
Hello, I'm Steve Wilson. Nice to meet you. Hi, nice to meet you.
Sally,
You want me to?
José Luis, mucho gusto. Sally.
I'm kind of wondering whether we should not like move to the sides. I feel
My title?
You're sort of on stage interrogation.
Senior program?
Yeah. Let's see how
Batala, right?
Yes.
Carmen views this matter.
Senior.
Program.
I think with just four of us, we could probably leave
Yeah,
the middle
kind of,
table.
right, and leave the center.
I feel like I'm in an interrogation.
And then
Not that I've ever been to interrogation. I
Right.
have to add, but
facing the child is not there.
But certainly, it's sort of central casting for a character.
Agent security.
for a role that I'm not sure I wish to.
Right. Carmen, excuse me, I'm sorry. Would it be, should somebody be in the center like this with the screen up
Move
or?
slightly
Oh,
to the sides.
Sure.
Hola,
Yeah.
¿cómo le va?
Oh, okay, maybe, yeah, maybe if you just, yeah,
I'll slide down. a bit.
okay. Perfect.
I'm happy to stand up. It's just I don't want to be like.
Okay, anything else I need to know? Okay.
Oh, pink on pink, bad idea. Didn't think about that one before. Also
I
bad
need
too.
to go over the writing with the
Yeah.
pens.
Well, there's a chance that I'm not gonna even do this. I'm filling in for someone,
I was about to
so
say you're not.
no, I'm not Lisa Palmer. So I'm just setting it up in case it's stupid.
Is it Batala?
Bathala.
Bathala. Okay, I can't never get these things right.
That's okay. Oh, thank you. I managed to make a mess here. Yes, I can.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry. It's okay.
I don't know.
Entonces, prefieres presentar de este. Okay.
Y ya para las preguntas, acá no estamos.
Entiendo. Me parece perfecto.
Okay. Yeah.
Carmen, is it okay? For example, Mr. Arellano, can he present standing up?
Do you mind?
Yeah,
Suddenly they seem to.
it's this spot. They're in the worst position, so it's good that we're on this end. 'Cause they have jackets on.
Es
Right.
primera vez acá en
En
el Wilson Center.
En el Wilson Center en Washington, sí.
Y en Washington
Sí,
también.
también.
Oh,
Yes, they
Sí,
do.
una
¿qué
ciudad
parece sobre
hermosa.
la ciudad?
Sí, es para caminar, disfrutarse. Una
Sí.
ciudad muy ordenada,
Sí, sí.
muy ordenada.
Abierto,
Oh,
más o menos.
yeah.
Sí,
No
sí.
es como Nueva York, que es
It's an
Bulla,
electricidad.
muy agradable.
Sí, 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 muy alto.
For that reason.
Mucho más.
Puedes caminar sin ningún problema.
Sí. Muy húmedo. El tiempo es
No,
feo.
es una ciudad muy emblemática, además, o sea,
Sí.
históricamente,
Sí.
culturalmente.
Sí, pero poco suave en comparación con Chicago.
O Nueva York.
Sí, sí,
es-
Nueva York.
sí, sí. ¿Tú trabajas acá en el Wilson?
No, con el BID, el
en
Banco
el BID.
Interamericano de
Ah,
Desarrollo.
sí, qué bueno.
En el headquarters,
Ah, muy bien.
2-3 cuadros de acá.
¿Has visitado México? ¿Has ido a México, Steve?
Oh, sí, muchas veces. Sí,
¿A Chiapas? Yo trabajo en
Chiapas
Chiapas.
una o dos veces.
Welcome back to the second panel. This second panel is on adaptation, health, agriculture, and food security. Our presenters are José Luis Arellano. He is a project manager for operations and conservation at the Southern Border Basin Agency, National Water Commission of Mexico. José Luis presented in a Chiapas project, a very interesting project in Chiapas, and he was one of our speakers at El Salvador seminar. Salia Edwards is an advisor for the Sustainable Development and Environmental Health at the Pan American Health Organization, office for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean countries, and her presentation in Barbados was key for the audience because she was linking climate change, health, and water. Lisa Palmer is not here. She was struck in a plane or transport. But Sandeep Bathala is a senior program associate with Environmental Change and Security program at the Wilson Center. Sandeep has been with us in almost all seminars, I think at least in 5 seminars presenting the population dynamics component of the seminar. And our moderator today is Stephen Wilson. He is a senior manager of projects for the Multilateral Investment Fund in the Inter-American Development Bank and the designer of product project. Stephen was one of our international speakers in the Bogota project in the second seminar we had in Bogota. So we are bringing all together, and the floor is yours.
Mr. Arellano.
Buen día a todos. Agradezco la atenta invitación que nos hizo el Centro Wilson, la Agencia de Desarrollo de Estados Unidos, y compartir con ustedes una experiencia de un trabajo de restauración de cuencas en el estado mexicano de Chiapas, frontera con Guatemala. Esta es la cuenca del río Huehuetán. Como se habló en la mesa anterior, la media de lluvia en México es de 770 milímetros, pero varía geográficamente. Yo me voy a referir a la parte sur de México, que es donde tenemos mayor cantidad de agua de lluvia en México, donde llueve más de 2.000 milímetros y en el área de trabajo casi 4.000 milímetros al año. ¿Qué es esta área limítrofe con Guatemala? Esta es una de las cuencas costeras características de la Sierra Madre de Chiapas, donde del parteaguas a la planicie En 2.000 metros se recorren en menos de 20 kilómetros. Son cuencas de respuesta hidrológica muy, muy rápida. Por estas características de relieve, de carga de agua, de condición geológica, son cuencas muy vulnerables a los procesos de erosión hídrica y sedimentación. En la zona tenemos diferentes trayectorias de aporte de humedad, por eso tenemos lluvias de 3.500 a 4.000 metros, 4.000 milímetros al año, provenientes del Pacífico, a través del Caribe y de los nortes. Muestro la distribución geográfica muy rápido de la lluvia anual en la cuenca de estudio. En estas cuencas se suceden diferentes procesos de degradación ambiental, de cambio de uso de suelo, incendios forestales, deforestación, erosión hídrica y finalmente deslizamientos, derrumbes. Esta es la foto de septiembre de 98. Este es el humo que generaron los puntos rojos, que son los incendios forestales que se dieron por cambio de uso de suelo en el sur de México. Estos procesos de degradación ambiental en cuencas a lo largo del tiempo aumentan la tasa de sedimentación, de erosión hídrica, disminuyen la capacidad de escurrimiento de caudal base y se manifiestan en diferentes procesos e impactos. Entonces es importante entender estos procesos hidrológicos en su límite natural, que es la cuenca. De esta forma, por ejemplo, en esta cuenca tenemos lo que llamamos coeficiente de escurrimiento, la relación de lo que escurre respecto a lo que llueve en cada cuenca. E históricamente esta cuenca tiene una tendencia decreciente, quiere decir que la cuenca tiene una capacidad para infiltrar el agua de lluvia. Es una cuenca con el 80% de cobertura con bosques de café, o sea, con café con sombra. Sí, es una cuenca de este tipo. Por el contrario, una cuenca donde tenemos cambios de uso de suelo, observen aquí cómo va disminuyendo la cobertura forestal en el tiempo y el coeficiente de escurrimiento tiene tendencias crecientes. ¿Sí? El suelo ya no infiltra la cantidad de agua, por la cobertura ha cambiado, entonces esa agua baja torrencialmente. Entonces, esos procesos, erosión, sedimentación, lluvia, escurrimiento, están interrelacionados. ¿Sí? Si queremos hacer gestión de riesgos de inundación en las planicies, debemos de entender que el agua proviene de las partes altas. Sí, eso es muy, muy importante. Porque estos procesos están interrelacionados y actualmente en Chiapas, como en muchos de nuestros países, están siendo catalizados por cambio climático global. Está acelerando estos procesos, ¿sí? Más la intervención antrópica, la presión de uso de recursos, genera toda esta serie de procesos interrelacionados. En México somos muy vulnerables a diferentes problemas por eventos hidrometeorológicos extremos. Muestro la trayectoria de los diferentes fenómenos hidrometeorológicos extremos, tanto en el Pacífico como en la costa del Golfo de México. A lo largo del tiempo, particularmente en Chiapas, pues vienen de ambos lados los problemas. Si hacemos el análisis del régimen de lluvias, por ejemplo, en una zona cafetalera en Chiapas en 100 años, observamos que los años lluviosos se están haciendo más frecuentes. Y observamos también que hay una correlación entre los años niño y los años niña, y esto es entre los años secos y los años lluviosos. Entonces, esta es una muestra de que el cambio climático global está teniendo manifestaciones locales en nuestros países. En este caso está alterando el régimen hidrológico de esta zona al sur de México, en Chiapas, ¿no? Si hacemos ese mismo análisis para lo que llueve día con día en promedio o la lluvia en 24 horas, máxima en 24 horas, la tendencia es análoga. Los eventos extremos o los picos se están haciendo más grandes y más frecuentes, ¿sí? Estamos hablando de láminas de lluvia de 370 milímetros. La mitad casi de lo que en promedio llueve en México cae en 24 horas en la Sierra Madre de Chiapas. Esa carga de agua, ¿sí? Entonces, bueno, y estos eventos de lluvia se están haciendo más frecuentes, más intensos. Este es el caso del huracán Stan en 2005. El Stan entró como categoría 1 por el Pacífico, por el Caribe, atravesó la península de Yucatán, se degradó, se cargó de agua en el Golfo de México, volvió a entrar por el Istmo y se degradó, pero las bandas nubosas del hidrometeorero chocaron con la Sierra Madre de Chiapas y descargaron toda su carga de agua. Y era ya tormenta tropical. Y dejó este paisaje de deslizamientos, erosión, sedimentación. Se estimaron en más de 50,000 deslizamientos en la Sierra Madre de Chiapas, en la parte mexicana, casi 12,000 en Guatemala. Grandes cargas de sedimento en presas, sedimentaciones que disminuyen la vida útil. Tenemos ahí la parte de las presas hidroeléctricas, que a veces en la mayor parte de México están en Chiapas. Y esto está asociado también a los cambios de uso de suelo en las cuencas, en las comunidades. Entonces, aquí de manera muy rápida muestro la dinámica de uso de suelo y las afectaciones por los impactos de lluvias extremas en nuestras poblaciones. Y es que los riesgos de desastre son función de dos variables, del riesgo potencial, pero sobre todo de la vulnerabilidad. Y esto es de lo susceptible que son nuestras ciudades, nuestras cuencas, nuestras comunidades a ese impacto de lluvias extremas. Podemos predecir con la tecnología actual trayectorias, magnitudes de ciclones, huracanes, pero donde tenemos una gran amplia posibilidad de trabajo es en vulnerabilidad. Entenderla como susceptibilidad de que eso impacte, ¿no? De esta forma, el riesgo de desastre depende de lo que llueve. Esa es una gráfica de un evento de lluvia de 237 milímetros, pero sobre todo de la vulnerabilidad. Y esto no es que el agua se metió a tu casa, tú te metiste a vivir en la casa del río. ¿Sí? Entonces hay que entender que los desastres no son naturales, son una construcción socioterritorial. Y eso es una ventana de oportunidad para las agencias, las instituciones, los gobiernos, todos los que trabajamos en gestión de riesgos. Ahí tenemos mucho que hacer. Esto está asociado con las comunidades humanas y es lo que se llama los medios de vida. La vulnerabilidad se descompone en diferentes formas y se expresan diferentes formas de capacidad de adaptación, fortalezas, atributos, recursos para ajustarse a las nuevas condiciones. Las comunidades se están adaptando a estas nuevas condiciones de lluvias extremas, están variando sus sistemas de cultivo. Entonces, debemos de entender toda esta serie de impactos y cómo se expresa la vulnerabilidad en nuestras comunidades. En los medios de vida, ¿sí? En el capital humano, en el capital natural, el capital financiero, el capital social, cultural, el capital físico, cómo se expresa en cada una de esas componentes, porque debemos de entenderlo como un todo, ¿sí? No solo debemos de ver la vulnerabilidad socioambiental, debemos de ver también la vulnerabilidad natural que tienen las laderas, las cuencas, las comunidades, como comentaron en la mesa anterior. Bueno, las comunidades que más impactos tienen, desgraciadamente, son las más pobres. Es por estas condiciones. Debemos de estudiar, descomponer la vulnerabilidad y cómo se expresan los diferentes medios de vida. De tal forma que en Sierra Madre de Chiapas tenemos riesgos climáticos por perturbaciones del régimen hidrológico, por cambios en el régimen de lluvia, por cambios de uso de suelo. Las cuencas de la Sierra Madre de Chiapas son más vulnerables a inundaciones y deslizamientos y está acelerando la marginación y la pobreza de las mismas comunidades. Este es el caso de Motocintla, que atraviesa 3 ríos. De esta forma, en Comisión Nacional del Agua, después del stand de 2008-2010, instrumentamos un programa de restauración hidrológica ambiental de cuencas. Normalmente las acciones gubernamentales se dirigen a las partes donde tenemos que reconstruir la infraestructura dañada por las inundaciones. Esta vez intentamos empezar a trabajar desde las partes altas de las cuencas, restaurar los deslizamientos, devolverle a la cuenca esa capacidad de amortiguamiento de las relaciones lluvia-escurrimiento. Es fundamental ese servicio ambiental de protección. No solo restaurar la infraestructura que dañó la creciente, sino hacerla más resistente a la cuenca, a esos eventos de lluvia extrema, ¿sí? Acelerar esos procesos de resiliencia ¿sí? O sea, no dejar sola la cuenca para que la madre naturaleza la restaure. Trata de incidir en eso, ¿no? Lo que hicimos fue hacer una estimación del riesgo de erosión en la cuenca, de deslizamientos, pero también estudiamos la vulnerabilidad socioambiental, qué tan pobres son nuestras comunidades, qué capacidad de organización tienen, de ingreso, de salud, de alimentación, porque eso también expresa el riesgo que tienen a ese impacto de lluvias extremas. De tal forma que mediante la metodología de medios de vida descomponemos la vulnerabilidad en esas componentes, ¿sí? En cuanto a su capital humano, en cuanto a su capital social, cómo están organizadas las comunidades, cómo hacer frente para resolver esta ecuación, ¿sí? Ante una amenaza, con esas condiciones de vulnerabilidad expresadas en esas componentes, ¿cuál es el riesgo que tenemos de desastre? Y entonces, enfocarnos en cualquiera de esos ejes, los más prioritarios, los que tienen más incidencia, ¿sí? Para trabajar en gestión de riesgos. De tal forma que la vulnerabilidad a deslizamientos depende de la vulnerabilidad socioeconómica, de la vulnerabilidad a la erosión, de la vulnerabilidad a los deslizamientos y de la vulnerabilidad a la inundación. Debemos descomponerla en esas componentes. No es solo un proceso hidrológico, es un proceso socioambiental. De tal forma que diseñamos un programa para restaurar por microcuencas, por cada una de las áreas tributarias, jerarquizamos cuáles eran las más prioritarias y tuvimos incidencia en las comunidades locales. Establecimos una línea base, hicimos un ordenamiento de prácticas, desarrollamos toda una componente de organización, capacitación, transferencia de tecnología por comunidades dentro de microcuencas prioritarias, ejecutamos prácticas de conservación de suelo y agua muy sencillas para cambiar los sistemas de cultivo y hacerlos más resistentes a esos impactos de lluvia y hicimos un ejercicio de monitoreo y evaluación. Seleccionamos cuáles eran las microcuencas más prioritarias para atender y sobre ellas iniciamos el trabajo. Organizamos a los usuarios que comparten una misma microcuenca, ladera o cañada, que comparten y la población no es el problema, es la solución de todos estos procesos. Ordenamos las prácticas, dónde va la reforestación, dónde van los sistemas agroforestales, dónde van las terrazas de mono vivo, dónde van las presas filtrantes, para que trabajen como un sistema, junto con los mismos agricultores en sus terrenos. Trazamos las prácticas de manera muy sencilla, con instrumentos muy sencillos, para que lo hagan los mismos agricultores, y establecimos pequeñas prácticas dentro de los sistemas de cultivo para control de erosión. Estas son presas filtrantes para control de erosión. Una presa filtrante te permite bajar el potencial hidráulico que tiene el torrente de agua. El sedimento queda en la parte alta, como pueden observar acá, ¿sí? Le quitamos energía cinética al agua, controlamos la erosión y lo hacemos con especies vegetativas locales de rápido crecimiento. Cuando empezamos lo hicimos con piedra acomodada, pero el esfuerzo de cargar y todo eso, la misma gente nos dijo, oiga, ingeniero, mejor usemos isote y cada una de esas especies yucca guatemalensis. Y como pueden observar, bueno, ahí quedan 8 metros cúbicos de sedimentos, ahí quedan. Ya no tiene la energía cinética esa agua de lluvia. ¿Sí? Y si sumamos eso, pues abajo ya no tenemos derrumbes y deslizamientos. Entonces es una tecnología, es una innovación de los mismos productores. De esta forma empezamos a restaurar los derrumbes que mostramos en las primeras partes. Y ya en capas más profundas, bueno, pues con costales de arena, con sistemas mixtos. En terrenos de cultivo, bueno, pues surcar al contorno, donde hay que renovar café, hay que hacerlo con terrazas individuales, toda una serie de sistemas, ¿sí? La idea es pasar de esta condición a esta condición, ¿sí? Acelerar la resiliencia, ¿sí? Hacer más resistentes estas laderas a esos impactos de agua de lluvia, con prácticas que se incorporan al sistema tecnológico, o sea, no son externas, son pequeñas variaciones en los sistemas de cultivo. Hicimos una evaluación de nuestro proyecto usando esta metodología cristal que nos permite evaluar participativamente los impactos de nuestra intervención. Esta se hace analizando el contexto climático del área del proyecto, cuáles son los medios de vida de las comunidades que están ahí, cuáles son los impactos del proyecto, cómo han impactado el proyecto en disminuir la vulnerabilidad, cuáles son los cambios que se han observado, ¿sí? Hicimos talleres con los que participaron en nuestro proyecto Hicimos entrevistas para analizar la visión de nuestros usuarios sobre el proyecto. Y encontramos cuáles son sus principales amenazas. Dicen, bueno, por ejemplo, lluvias extremas, ¿cuáles son los impactos que tienen ellos? Pérdidas de cosechas, ¿qué estrategias de respuesta se han hecho? ¿Funcionan? ¿No funcionan? ¿Qué hacer? Entonces, así vamos segregando la información. Por ejemplo, el caso de desbordamiento de ríos. Abandonan cultivos. Esto ha acelerado la migración. Antes, en esa región de Chiapas solo se veía cómo pasaban los hermanos centroamericanos. Ahora ya viene población chiapaneca acá a Estados Unidos. Y eso crea que se abandonen parcelas y eso rompe la economía rural local, la autosuficiencia propia de esas comunidades. Entonces son procesos que están interrelacionados. El caso de una segunda amenaza que ellos sienten, vientos fuertes, igual analizamos cuáles son los principales impactos, daños en cosechas, en viviendas, en árboles, qué estrategias, es sostenible, no sostenible. Otro impacto, la sequía prolongada, igual analizamos de acuerdo a la percepción de la gente, procesamos su información y analizamos para cada uno de los capitales, naturales, físicos, financieros, humanos, sociales, cuáles son los recursos más afectados y de qué manera han sido percibidos por la gente. De tal forma que si analizamos estos tres impactos, procesos que sufre la población local, las lluvias extremas, los vientos, la sequía, para cada una de esas 5 ejes, observamos que lluvias extremas tienen impacto en casi las 5 grandes variables, ¿sí? O sea, el pentágono se abre hacia ellas. Es algo que les duele por diferentes lados a las comunidades, a diferencia de las otras percepciones. De esta forma se han ensayado diferentes estrategias de adaptación. Se han diversificado cultivos, se han establecido sistemas agroforestales, se han ampliado las áreas con prácticas de conservación de suelos como las que les mostré para atender esta amenaza de lluvias extremas, ¿sí? Para vientos fuertes, bueno, sistemas agroforestales, se han hecho organizaciones, protección de manantiales para sequía de agua. O sea, estas son las estrategias que se han ensayado con el proyecto y que han instrumentado a la misma gente ante cada una de esas amenazas. Y al analizar para cada una de ellas cómo se manifiestan estas estrategias de adaptación, pues tenemos esa respuesta diferencial. De esta forma, por ejemplo, las prácticas de conservación de suelo tienen beneficios en prácticamente las 5 componentes de los medios de vida. Si observamos el pentágono con la línea roja, ¿sí? Mientras que la construcción y reparación de caminos, bueno, pues la componente de recursos naturales no tiene impacto ahí. A lo mejor porque no hemos usado bioingeniería, o sea, especies vegetales para estabilizar taludes, ¿no? Si hacemos eso sube. Entonces, esto nos permite tener una visión holística desde adentro, desde las comunidades, de cómo se expresan esas estrategias de adaptación a ese problema de cambio climático por lluvias extremas, o por vientos fuertes, o por sequía prolongada. Cada una de las estrategias que ensayan las comunidades, ¿no? De esta forma, presento las siguientes conclusiones. En Chiapas presenta condiciones naturales análogas a Centroamérica. Chiapas es la parte centroamericana de México. En el seminario que tuvimos en Salvador, pudimos percibir esas analogías culturales, históricas que tenemos y esos mismos desafíos que tenemos nuestros países. Cuando hablamos de México, México es muy diverso, diversísimo, pero la parte de Chiapas es la parte centroamericana, ¿no? Entonces, es ahí donde tenemos mucha incidencia con los amigos de Guatemala, Salvador, de Nicaragua. Las cuencas de Sierra Madre y Chiapas, como las de Centroamérica, son muy vulnerables a riesgos de deslizamientos e inundaciones. El cambio climático ha tenido diferentes manifestaciones en la hidrología local y también nos lo dijeron en Salvador nuestros amigos que están estudiando cambio climático. El cono seco centroamericano también atraviesa Chiapas. Entonces, ahí es donde tenemos una ventana de oportunidad para trabajar en equipo por regiones de nuestros países. Bueno, el programa que establecimos en Comisión Nacional del Agua fue de 2008 a 2010. y permitió contribuir con estas estrategias de adaptación, empezar a ensayar procesos de gestión de riesgos, gestión integral de riesgos de deslizamientos e inundaciones. Actualmente forma parte de las estrategias gubernamentales del Plan Nacional Hídrico, pero falta impulsar nuevamente este tipo de iniciativas, ¿no? Los recursos más afectados por amenazas climáticas son los naturales, los físicos, los recursos humanos y sociales son la clave. Repito, la población no es el problema, es la solución. Estos problemas debemos trabajar con ellos mismos. El proyecto que instrumentamos responde a las necesidades de las comunidades frente a los riesgos actuales ya de cambio climático. Cambio climático llegó, como dice la población local ahí en Chiapas, o te aclimatas o te aclimueres. Eso es adaptación y tenemos que trabajar por ahí, ¿no? El involucramiento de las comunidades en la formulación de las propuestas es fundamental. Nosotros como instituciones de gobierno no llegamos a imponer, debemos de leer sus necesidades y debemos de hacerlo de manera conjunta, porque si no solo va a sembrar un arbolito porque le está dando un insumo, no. Como comentó la compañera de Dominicana, bueno, hay que cultivar el bosque, o sea, que crezca. Bueno, es lo mismo, son procesos a largo y mediano plazo, pero afortunadamente ya se están incorporando a sus sistemas de cultivo, ¿no? Bueno, finalmente, bueno, ya les comenté que nuestro programa de restauración ambiental ahora ya forma parte de las líneas de acción de los instrumentos de política del sector hídrico en el país. Y eso es lo que quería compartir con ustedes en muy poco tiempo. Cierro con una reflexión de Ayocuan Cuapetsin, es un poeta rey parecido a Netzahualcóyotl, que ustedes a lo mejor conocen más. Él decía que permanezca la tierra, que estén en pie los árboles. Creo que eso aplica y es vigente todavía para nosotros. Gracias.
Gracias.
Hello. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Arellano, for a very interesting presentation. I think we will wait until the end of all three speakers to field questions from the audience, but I did have one question for you, sir. You mentioned in your very interesting presentation the multiple vulnerabilities facing different stakeholders, different groups, communities, and in this very transverse threat of climate change. In your experience in Chiapas, have you noticed, you mentioned, for example, ejidos, ejidatarios, ejido-type property holders. Have you noticed differences in responses to this threat coming from either communities or from ejido-type land arrangements or from purely private property owners? We work on this issue around Latin America and have discerned that sometimes a for-profit, a completely private rancher or farmer looks at this sometimes differently and has certain advantages or disadvantages over, say, a community, or in the case of Mexico, an ejido holding might have advantages working with the public sector. Just curious if you have any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Sí, Steve. De hecho, no es que haya diferentes vulnerabilidades, más bien existen diferentes componentes de la vulnerabilidad y la sumatoria de cada una de esas componentes te da la vulnerabilidad que tiene la comunidad, la cuenca, ¿sí? O sea, tenemos que verlo como una función de varias variables interrelacionadas. Ahora, respecto a los ejidos y la propiedad, en el caso de México, la diferencia es de escala. Los finqueros cafetaleros de Soconusco, que es la zona cafetalera de Chiapas que les mostré, también están ensayando prácticas para la adaptación a la amenaza de las lluvias extremas. Sus fincas también se derrumban, hay deslizamientos, también hay pérdidas en sus cosechas de café. También ellos están ensayando este tipo de estrategias de adaptación. La diferencia es que ellos tienen una superficie mayor que la que tienen los ejidos. Además, comparten la misma cuenca. Por ejemplo, la cuenca del Huehuetán, donde trabajamos con los finqueros y trabajamos con los ejidos, ¿sí? De hecho, en Huehuetán trabajamos en finca Argovia y el dueño de la finca nos presentó a los ejidos alrededor. O sea, es un problema de escala nada más, pero impacta a ambos, a los propietarios, a los ejidatarios, y ambos están ensayando estrategias de adaptación.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, well, we'll now proceed to Sally Edwards, advisor for the Sustainable Development and Environmental Health at the Pan American Health Organization, World Health Organization Office for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean countries.
Good morning, everybody. I know I have a very long title, and I'm sorry for that, but I can't do much about it. So I'm going to briefly go through or introduce health into the conversation. I think we've not heard so much about health yet this morning. So first of all, I'll go through some of what we know about the relationship between human health and climate change, what could be the health sector response, and then some experience of a project that we're currently undertaking in Dominica, and then some final thoughts. So the relationship between human health I'm talking about, if I forget the word human, please know that when I talk about health, I'm talking about human health, and environmental changes is extremely complex, and we don't fully understand quite a lot of it, but what we do know is that there are enormous numbers of interconnections, and it needs to be looked at from quite a broad perspective, because there isn't any sort of only unidirectional relationship of just two things. It's a very complex web of interrelationships. There are many different dimensions of the change, going from individual needs to the social needs and basic needs that we all have, and this relationship between economic, environmental and social dimensions is something that we need to understand in order to really fully understand some of the relationships between human health and environmental change. So this is out of the IPCC, but just to say, really the bits in yellow are essentially some of the aspects that they're risks that we can't do that much about, whereas the parts in red are really the bits that we can reduce through proper adaptation mechanisms. So when you go through the projected changes, you see that focusing sort of on some of the health effects related to water, undernutrition, for example, there is quite a lot that we can do through adaptation mechanisms to reduce the risks. The same goes for food and waterborne infections. That, you know, there are lots of adaptation mechanisms that we can put in place to reduce those risks. So in the latest reports of IPCC, they looked at sort of key risks and adaptation issues and prospects that can come about. And so I just took out the Central and South America slide and the small island state slides, which will come later. But the two sort of things from the Central America slide, but that apply throughout, I think, is the issue of early warning systems. Now, in a project in Barbados that we have just concluded, where we were looking at dengue, we were trying to establish early warning systems, but it's extremely complex with the health data that we currently have often in small islands, because you need a certain amount of data in order to get statistically significant models, really, especially going into the future. And it became an issue of whether we use sort of laboratory confirmed cases of a disease or whether we use proxies for a disease, and what implications that has, and what biases or what else we're bringing into the model if we don't use absolute sort of confirmed disease data. So, you know, there are issues with the early warning systems, but I think it is something that we need to work much more on. And also to bring out the issue of rainwater storage in water scarce environments. There are issues that can come about by adaptation options on health. So in Barbados, back in the 90s, they introduced a planning policy related to rainwater storage, saying that buildings over a certain size needed to have rainwater storage capacity. But into their planning process, the sort of permissions that went along with it, they didn't introduce or they didn't specify whether those rainwater storage facilities had to have pumps or what the water could be used for. So as a result of which, we've had enormous proliferation of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in Barbados, and the dengue problem has sort of gone out of control. So when we think about adaptation options, it's very important that we think about some of the other consequences that they could have and make sure that we're looking at all of the pluses and the minuses that they could have, and what can we do with regard to the minuses, because sometimes they're very easy things to correct. So small island developing states, again, you know, this is projections. Often when we talk about small island states, the first thing that people talk about are the sea level rise. So just an example of one of the adaptation, I guess, options that Barbados went for was the construction of coastal zone protection on the south coast. But when they constructed it, they looked at it fairly broadly, and they didn't only build coastal zone protection, but they made it into a boardwalk. So they then increased the recreational use of that facility. It is a successful coastal zone protection, but it's also an extremely successful recreational area where people are walking, and in a country that has very high levels of non-communicable diseases, it has provided, you know, a very welcome avenue for people to exercise, to walk, where there are no cars, there's no danger from road traffic, vehicular accidents, and I mean, certainly during daytime hours is extremely well used. So some of the health outcomes of climate change, I've grouped them by health outcomes. Excuse me. I'm clearly not going to go through all of them in the time that I have. I'm going to focus mainly on the ones that I regard as being related to water, the subject of today. So, you know, we've heard about the issues today of water in the right amount, but one of the things I wanted to bring is the aspect of water in the right amount isn't only about the provision of water now, but also with extreme weather events, it can destroy some of our provision of water. So the picture on the top right is the desalinization plant in Tacloban in the Philippines, which for the hospital, which was totally and utterly destroyed by the super typhoon Yolanda back in 2013. So their hospital suddenly had no water because there was no water coming in. And the destructive nature of extreme weather events can lead to challenges in the right access to the right amount of water, even when it was provided beforehand. But it's not only about water in the right amount, it's also about water in the right quality. So as was mentioned earlier today, the MDG for provision of safe water has essentially been met in this region on paper, although, as was discussed, there are many differences within each country, but there's also, especially in the Caribbean, that the infrastructure is aging and failing. And so when we were talking about water losses earlier, it means that there's a lot of breakages within the system. So even though you might have treated water being put into the system at the beginning, that is not what's coming out in people's houses. And so this then leads to lots of questions about, well, when we talk about the provision of safe water, yes, they have access to piped water, but is the water that's coming out of those pipes of a quality that we regard safe for human consumption? And the answer often is no. In Barbados, when they do measurements in people's houses, there's often 0 chlorine residual in the water that's piped, although there is chlorine residual put in at the pumping stations. There are also cultural issues to do with chlorine in water, that people are starting to go against the idea of consuming chemicals, and they view having chlorinated water as introducing lots of chemicals into their diet that they don't necessarily want. And so there is a pushback against chlorination of water in the Caribbean, but this leads to all sorts of complications when it comes to health of the provision of safe water. So foodborne diseases and nutrition, with the water patterns, sea surface temperatures and sea surface patterns, things like cholera in the Caribbean can survive quite well in the water there. It's of the right pH, it's of the right temperature. And so following the outbreak of cholera in Haiti, there was then concern in the rest of the Caribbean chain about the potential for the introduction of cholera from the water. It's in mollusk food that the Caribbean people eat. And so quite a lot of work then went on in the other Caribbean countries down the line, even though they're not directly neighbours, because of the patterns that can come. Also, the storage of grains is something that in drought proliferate countries, people start to store grains more. And we know that with drought, there can be quite a lot of aflatoxin being produced, and aflatoxin poisonings. When we talk about waterborne diseases, there are several waterborne diseases, such as ciguatera, that we know has neurological effects, that is expanding a lot in its geographical expanse. And so people need to start looking for these other diseases in places where traditionally they weren't necessarily found. The Southern Caribbean has never before really seen ciguatera, but now is starting to see. And I know that the Carolinas are also beginning to see ciguatera poisoning. So it's sort of expanding out from where people generally think of it as being. And also with urbanization, the changes in pollutants in water are increasing. And in islands where we do desalination for consumption, if those pollutants are going in very close to desal plants, which take their water from fairly near to shore, then suddenly we're introducing pollutants into the water chain without necessarily thinking of that chain, because we just think it's going out into the sea, but we're not thinking about, well, we're actually taking seawater back to desalinate it. Regarding vector-borne and zoonotic diseases, I put this in there because a lot of people don't necessarily think of them as being waterborne diseases, and it's not necessarily from consumption of water, but as I mentioned earlier, when we store water in order to produce food, in order to have enough water to consume, we're also increasing the potential for Aedes aegypti proliferation. And not only that, the climate change has an influence on not only the mosquitoes themselves, but also the viruses and the transmission cycles, the extrinsic incubation periods within the mosquito. So it really does, climate change and water really do have an impact on vector-borne and zoonotic diseases. So weather-related mortality and morbidity, again, with extreme hydrometeorological events, you can get a release of toxic chemicals from landfills when you get excessive precipitation, and this goes not only into the groundwater but also into the seawater, which we then take back and desalinate. Raw sewage, the Caribbean still has a lot of septic tank systems, some of which are aging and not necessarily constructed for the population that is now using them. With extreme precipitation events, they can overflow, and so there is an issue not only in terms of the contamination of drinking water with the sewage, but also it's this is a part of the world which has enormous numbers of tourism, and tourists like to go and swim in the sea, and we are, the sewage is sometimes going into the sea following rainfall. So there is this challenge of, how do we do something about it without necessarily telling the tourists that they're swimming in water that has sewage in. And then the issue of food safety following extreme weather events. Not only food that comes in at the ports, food in supermarkets, food in stores, food in our own house, we sometimes keep it very low to the ground. Flooding can contaminate enormous amounts of food. In St. Lucia, following the flooding in December 2013, they had to get rid of all of their stocks of food that had come in for the supermarkets because it had all been contaminated because it was stored on the ground. The ships don't come in very often, so it then left them in a very precarious position of not having enough food to provide before that they could get another ship to come in. So correct storage of food is extremely important where you have these extreme weather events and flooding. And then sea level rise. Again, we've talked about some of this, but the point I want to point out is the coastal wells. Coastal wells are quite shallow. In Barbados, we've had to close several of the pumping wells because they've become infiltrated with seawater, and so it's now saline because they're just so close to the sea, and as sea level goes up, that infiltration can be quite significant. So what can the health sector really do? Well, PAHO WHO has a strategic plan and plan of action on climate change and health with 4 main areas: evidence, awareness raising, partnerships, and adaptation. And these are the 4 things that we try and look at. So with relation to evidence, it's the issue of vulnerability and adaptation assessments on a national level that we are really trying to focus on at the moment. And this also goes to adaptation because you need to do the vulnerability and adaptation assessment to then plug into, well, what do you then do about it? How do you adapt? But if you don't know really what the vulnerable areas are, you can't adapt. So this is a process that we are currently doing in Dominica. And in Dominica, in the vulnerability assessment, we decided to focus really on vector-borne diseases, food safety and security, and on water quality, all of which are very related to issues of water. Dominica is not a water-scarce country by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a country that doesn't necessarily have even access to water, and a country that does suffer quite a lot from extreme weather events. So what we wanted to really do is assess the vulnerability in order to prioritize in program planning to reduce the transmission of disease in the future. So it's a very intersectoral approach. Dominica has a National Climate Change Steering Committee, and so which is made up of all of the different sectors of that they believe are implicated in climate change in Dominica. And the Project Steering Committee includes not only the National Climate Change Steering Committee, but also the World Meteorological Organization, PAHO WHO, and Health Canada, and the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but so what we did for each sort of area, we looked at surveillance, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptations for vector-borne diseases, for waterborne diseases, and for food safety and security to try and get an idea of really, with relation to those three things, where are the vulnerabilities in Dominica. It is still a work in progress, so I'm not going to share results with you because it's still ongoing. So, some final thoughts, really. The bad news about adaptation is we can't really see the future clearly. And not all climate risks are avoidable, as I sort of mentioned earlier, but some of them are, or there's something that we can do about them to lessen the risks. Let me put it that way. So health continues often to be neglected in climate change support mechanisms. The funds awarded for health are often very, very small compared to the funds awarded to other sectors. But what are some of the potential explanations for that? And the health community is largely absent from the NAPA process at national level. And it's extremely important, as I've said, for adaptation strategies that health is also included and looked at so that we don't have cases such as in Barbados where we have a proliferation of Aedes aegypti coming from an adaptation option where a very simple tool could have been put in place to stop that happening. With regard also to the early warning systems, the GEF project that just recently concluded in Barbados, but it was part of a global project, and guidance was developed, on establishing early warning systems as part of that project. And we hope that not only that guidance, but also the lessons learned from that project will help in the process of including health within the national processes. There are a lot of lessons learned from that process, and often, as we know, climate change generally resides in the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Social Development, and so it's very important that that linkage be made to health and health be included at the table. So what are some of the water solutions? Well, there are many that have been talked about earlier on in the presentations, but I want to highlight two, and that's one is this issue of the reuse of water. The reinjection of treated wastewater into aquifers or rainwater storage being reinjected into aquifers. These are all things that can be very difficult culturally for people to accept, and yet they can have huge benefits. So the photo I have there is of a project actually in Jordan, but which we had Barbados go and visit, because they have a tomato greenhouse where they're using 3 different types of water in different rows of the tomatoes to show people that actually if you do the irrigation correctly, so if you have large irrigation efficiency, drip irrigation systems with barriers in between the water and the crops, you can use wastewater for irrigating plants that are for human consumption with no risk to health, because the produce is not coming into contact with the water at any point in the system. So it goes back, if we increase efficiency in irrigation and for the climate, but also use these barrier technologies, there are lots of things we can do with the water we already have and reuse it. And then the contentious issue of decreasing the amounts of meat in our diets, because we all know that meat uses an awful lot of water to consume. So the last slide I have is from FAO, where it looks at the amount of water needed to produce several items. So one beef steak requires 7,000 litres of water, whereas one potato is 25 litres of water. So yes, we need to have a balanced diet, but we also need to take account of some of the water issues and sustainability issues that go around with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation. just a question. I completely agree that health and is not at the table in the sort of the climate policy framework yet. I have a neighbor, I live 10 miles from here on the other side of the Potomac River, who's in a wheelchair, an older gentleman, 2 years ago went golfing, came home, didn't feel well, went to the hospital. Turned out he had West Nile virus that went into meningitis, and he's still paralyzed. This was a vector-borne mosquito disease that I believe was discovered in the late 30s in Uganda, much lower latitude, which CDC said, I think about 15 years ago, shouldn't be a problem outside of the deep south in this country. And last summer we had almost 200 cases in New York State. So the health, I think that the health framework here is gradually coming around to the fact that, climate change means changes in health challenges. But even here, you don't see that interface. Do you think it's just going to be the continued undeniable evidence, unfortunately, of human health challenges as a result of changing climate that's going to drive this? Or will, clearer heads prevail? Is it going to be driven by crisis?
Oh, it is on. I was expecting a light or something. Unfortunately, I think that humans tend to be quite reactionary. We react to what happens, and I think we might, hopefully not, but I think that we might just end up just trying to react to all these things as an afterfact rather than being able to put things in place beforehand. WHO globally has been working on climate change and health for a couple of decades now, but I think it's still something that, and there are, the people who work on climate change and health globally is a relatively small community, and we often know each other. CDC does a lot of work on climate change and health, the National Institutes of Health do, but it's often not still at the forefront. We're still second-class citizens in the debate, let me put it that way. After such a long time, will it change? I think it needs a champion to change it, because certainly a lot of work's being done on it.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, moving ahead, as we mentioned, our third speaker, unfortunately, we got hung up on an airplane, so that requires an adaptive response, I think, on our part. And we're lucky to have Sandeep Bathala here, who's the Senior Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Maternal Health Initiative. She's led a lot of work on planning and developing and implementing lots of the Wilson Center's works and conferences on health, environment, livelihoods, population, and other issues, including, of course, the one that we're discussing today. So she has gamely and in a very resilient way stood up to the plate here to present Lisa Palmer's work. So thank you very much.
Steve. So as you've noticed and heard, I am not Lisa Palmer. And I hope that I'm a much more dynamic speaker than it's about to appear, because I'm going to read her comments. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that I have been privileged to be part of this project and had the opportunity to present on population dynamics and climate change adaptation. I guess it was in El Salvador, in Colombia, in Peru. And then do a little work with regards to our efforts in Jamaica as well. So I looked at things a little different, but I felt since Lisa was going to be talking about population dynamics and food security, I'd just spend 1 minute talking about what was done in El Salvador in particular, because you may have already heard that there was a bit of an emphasis on food security in that discussion. And so I really looked at the connections between population, reproductive health, and food security. security, and really examined how, with the work of one of our consultants in particular, with our environmental change security program, who's here, and also going to help put together a policy brief on today's efforts. But she really on our blog had looked at these connections and really focused and noticed that there was a pretty exclusive focus on a single path of population growth. And by looking and accepting that one path and accepting it as destiny, essentially, we were missing major opportunities in the realm of reproductive health and family planning that could have had significant implications for future food demand and food security outcomes. And so by drawing conclusions, we broaden the range of opportunities that can be undertaken with regards to a more comprehensive way to ensure sustainability and food security and capacity for adaptation to climate change. And so that was a bit of what we had done in El Salvador. Melissa is an independent journalist and a fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, also called Succinct. And today she was going to offer her perspectives from reporting on population dynamics, specifically offering perspectives on Latin America. And she was also going to talk to you about about the research she is learning being a fellow at Succinct. First, as we've been talking about today, climate change is altering agriculture across a variety of societies. But what does that mean for global food security, especially the world's most vulnerable people? That's what she hopes to uncover as she continues the research and reporting that she's started as a scholar here at the Wilson Center. She was affiliated actually with the program that I work with, the Environmental Change Security Program. So her forthcoming book is Hot, Hungry Planet, and it's a narrative about people attempting to reconcile the threat of climate change with the need to feed a growing population. And today her remarks touch on some of the population dynamics related to agriculture in Latin America, as well as what that means for climate adaptation. So she was going to begin in Colombia. So Colombia's population is about 45 million people. It ranks high on the Human Development Index and is an upper middle income country. Yet poverty is a major issue for over 52% of the population, and 69% of the population in rural areas lives below the poverty line. Colombia also has one of the highest rates of displaced people due to the effects of past civil conflict. The World Bank estimates that 3.7 million people, or almost 10% of the population in Colombia, are vulnerable to climate change. These vulnerable people live primarily in two areas: the Andes, where water storage and land degradation pose problems, and in coastal areas prone to sea level rise. Key sectors in Colombia have been affected by a changing climate, including agricultural and livestock, water resources, coastal systems, human health, and ecosystems, and the services they provide. Considering the vulnerability of its rural population, climate adaptation will be important to building resilience, especially in agriculture, both in the production of important crops like rice and sugarcane, but also in the production of livestock. She's reported from Colombia last year on a travel grant from the Solutions Journalism Network, and she visited some of the areas in transition to report on what people are doing to improve degraded lands, improve food security, and conserve water resources. Because such a large proportion of the population living in rural areas fall under the poverty line and their livelihoods depend on agriculture, she met with some of the people who are trying new techniques around agriculture and livestock production, agroforestry, crop diversification, and alternative food sources through local initiatives. Many coffee farmers who are unable to continue growing coffee because yields plummeted after experiencing increasingly significant temperatures have switched their production. One farmer she met with switched crops. The farmer had a portion of her land planted as coffee, but transitioned it to shade-grown coffee under plantain trees, and the rest of her land is planted for intensive grazing through innovative agroforestry systems for cattle grazing. She also planted groves of fruit trees. She was savvy with her investments in improving her land. After hearing about opportunities at a community meeting, she was able to get a loan discounted by 40% to plant trees for agroforestry because these systems also provided other benefits for ecosystems, such as improvements in soil and water conservation. And I know we heard a bit about that earlier today. Other farms that Lisa toured also diversified. They started growing high-value specialty crops like pepper, vanilla, stevia, and some rice farmers adopted special irrigation systems and soil moisture and fertilizer management plans for growing rice to deal with scarce and unpredictable water sources and changing El Niña events, which are leading to increasing incidents of prolonged droughts. In Colombia, rains are also coming earlier in some areas than farmers had typically experienced. Many of them depend on techniques that fathers and grandfathers use and have resisted some of the adaptation efforts that researchers and agricultural federations are promoting. Along these lines, population dynamics in Ecuador mean that more people are vulnerable to extreme weather events from Enso La Nina, and by the fact that 96% of the urban population lives in coastal and mountainous regions. The extreme events associated with floods, droughts, and heat waves could produce severe socioeconomic and environmental impacts, including crop failure, fires, and energy insecurity from loss of hydropower. Population dynamics to improve rural food security by such investments like instituting agroforestry and payment for environmental services or credit systems for soil, water, and biodiversity conservation would provide long-term sustainable sources of diverse fruits, nuts, and fodder for people and livestock while mitigating climate change and soil erosion. The age structure of Ecuador's rural population, as well as the migrations of young people to cities, points to vulnerabilities for food security and adapting to climate change. Another case study Lisa wanted to highlight is Nicaragua. She recently met with researchers who are working on a research project at Succinct. To better understand their research and analysis, she wanted to share some more information about Succinct. Environmental problems are by definition social problems. That's why today we are talking about things like population dynamics and the environment, climate, extreme weather, drought, what have you. Succinct was founded on the premise that progress toward a sustainable future requires new knowledge that arises from close collaborations across many disciplines, for example, the natural and social sciences, humanities, NGOs, and agencies. There's also another piece to research at Succinct, and that's that knowledge is actionable and that it can mean something for decision makers. One of the new research teams at Succinct has focused on Nicaragua to expand and understand the ways increased market integration, new technologies, and demographic changes impacts biological diversity, ecosystems, services, and resource valuation. The role of globalization and population dynamics is having a great impact on Latin America. In this case, the researchers are looking to better understand not only the migrations of people moving into indigenous regions, but the effects of a road that has been built. This area of the Pearl Lagoon Basin in Atlantic Nicaragua is a coastal system well suited for examining the mechanisms and consequences of rapid change that are resulting from road access to Managua. Basically, how are people adapting or changing to globalization? What kinds of changes in ecosystems should they expect that might impact sustainability? Historically, this region has largely relied on its natural resources for subsistence. Now, fishermen are trading their catch for export to the Chinese market. They're planting cash crops for the first time. With a study that integrates the ecological data, ethnographic, demographic, and social data and economic data from 4 decades, the researchers are looking to correlate with changes in biodiversity and ecosystem services to determine whether current policies are acting to conserve, enhance, or diminish them. Her comments are available on the table outside. Towards the end of them, she specifically highlights 2 articles that she had written. One is called In the Pastures of Colombia, Cows, Crops, and Timber Coexist. And that's about an ambitious program in Colombia demonstrating combining grazing and agricultural with tree cultivation and how it can coax more food from each acre, boost farmers' incomes, restore degraded landscapes and make farmland more resistant to climate change. Another piece was called Agricultural Movement Tackles Challenges of a Warming World, and that was with a focus on temperatures rising and extreme weather becoming more frequent. The Climate Smart Agricultural Campaign is using a host of measures, from planting practices to improved water management, to keep farmers ahead of the disruptive impacts of climate change. Also, in addition to those two links to those two articles, is more information, including the website, her website, the website of Succinct, and then the website of her forthcoming book. And it also includes her email address, so you can be in touch with her. And she is very sorry and disappointed not to be with us today. She's actually stuck in Vermont and could not get a flight back to DC until 4 o'clock. So we couldn't even flip the panels around a bit to accommodate her. So I think she did have a lot of valuable things to say. Probably easier to read amongst yourselves than me doing it out loud. So I would encourage you to grab the handout on your way out to lunch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was a great summary of somebody else's work. Very well done. I have the privilege at the IDB of working in Colombia and Nicaragua and many other countries in agriculture. And you know, it comes as no surprise that people who are in agriculture, whether it's on a commercial basis or for their families' livelihoods exclusively, have no trouble accepting that the basic patterns are changing, although they may not have a particular theory or a keen awareness of climate modeling or climate scenarios. Certainly everywhere we go, particularly about rainy seasons, we hear some version of it doesn't start when it used to or end when it was, used to. And so anybody, usually of an age of about 35 or younger, has seen significant shifts in their lifetime. And so there's not a big discussion about why people have to be open and flexible about considering new ways of doing things. Our clients, for the most part in agriculture, have no formal mechanism to transfer risk. We are working with some of the big reinsurance companies on so-called parametric programs, which frankly are still a boutique. These are insurance schemes that pay off against, that don't pay off against actual damages, but against meteorological events like certain wind or rain metrics, which their models tell them lead to certain average damages and so forth. So we're trying to do what we can to promote risk transfer for small, vulnerable farmers in the region. But in many cases, we believe trying to build resilience in as cost-effective way as possible, given the uncertainty, the future uncertainty of the timing and the magnitude of these damages, is probably the best de facto form of insurance small producers can access at this point. Also, when you start talking in agriculture about larger holders, there is a political economy to this, and it's not about policy and climate justice. It's about the issue of stranded assets. I mean, there's a lot of work being done now looking at petroleum assets and how much of those might still be in the ground in 50 years based on relative prices going forward in terms of policy and carbon pricing. But if you want to talk to a large landholder, say of coffee assets somewhere in Central America or in Colombia, and you want to have a public conference and bring in the best modeling you can and suggest that perhaps in 20 to 25 years, the 5,000 or 6,000 hectares that this individual may own may not be commercially viable for, say, coffee, you're not going to get always a great reception. Any more than a homeowner on the North Carolina Outer Banks wants to hear that they may be underwater within a generation. So there is I work in the private sector. There is a strong resistance, not ideological, but about but about the valuation of assets and what this could all mean. Because as we know, markets can tip well in advance of the climate. And if the perception is that a certain class of assets are discounted, that pricing can come in very quickly. And that is something that I think a lot of smart people are looking at in the world. But in any case, getting back to her comments about knowledge and collaboration across many disciplines, it is absolutely abundantly evident that in agriculture, this transverse threat requires bringing to bear practical information for producers who are vulnerable, and collaboration. We all burn incense to public-private, but in this case, we're looking at possibly the largest PPP that the world has ever seen going forward. So without any further ado, we should have a few questions. Between you and lunch, I recognize deeper primal facts that cannot food. So if we could, if there are any questions for any of our speakers. Sir, you were first, and then you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Julio Guiti from SUDEC Inc. My question is for Mr. Orellano. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about, if you can give us an assessment or how you assess the level of coordination between the activities that are taking place at the federal level, the national level, and the local level in the case of climate adaptation strategies. Mexico was perhaps the first country that I think that had that created an investment plan under the Climate Investment Fund with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, of course. So if you can please share your thoughts about that level of coordination, and if you see that there is a room for improvement, what would be those areas? Thank you.
Sí, definitivamente las cuestiones de coordinación yo lo leería en dos ámbitos, vertical y horizontal. Y esto es entre los diferentes niveles de gobierno, hablo de México, el gobierno federal, gobierno estatal, gobiernos municipales, ¿sí? Esa sería una primera escala, ¿no? Donde realmente es necesario niveles de coordinación, pero particularmente en los aspectos de atribuciones que tiene cada uno de ellos. Por ejemplo, los problemas de inundaciones. Los permisos para establecer casas en las márgenes de los ríos los dan los municipios. Sin embargo, la delimitación de las zonas de riesgos la hace el gobierno federal, la hace la Conagua. Dice, hasta acá llega la mancha de inundación con cierta probabilidad. Entonces, bueno, allá hay todo un andamiaje que hay que corregir. Ahora, en nuestros países, el gran desafío no solo es esa cuestión de coordinación, sino la cuestión del ámbito de los instrumentos legales, las leyes, ¿sí? Hasta dónde aplica uno, hasta dónde la otra, o sea, es complejísimo. Y creo que es uno de nuestros grandes desafíos de nuestros países, porque se están estableciendo áreas habitacionales en áreas de riesgo, en las márgenes de los ríos y en las laderas escarpadas. Pero lo que hay detrás de eso son los instrumentos con los que se están haciendo esas autorizaciones. No es la autoridad que le corresponde hacer eso, ¿sí? Ese es un primero. Ahora, el otro ámbito de lectura es el que hago en cuanto a lo que es el ámbito legislativo. Efectivamente, en México es de los primeros países que estableció un marco legal, tiene una ley de cambio climático, tiene una coordinación de instituciones gubernamentales para hacer frente al cambio climático. Ha sido sede de la COP en Cancún y inclusive en mi estado, en Chiapas, hay una legislación estatal sobre cambio climático. Pero el gran desafío es cómo instrumentar las leyes. Podemos tener la mejor ley, pero si no tenemos una estructura para hacerla operativa, si no le colocamos un sistema de incentivos, subsidios, estímulos, si no alineamos programas gubernamentales, en la mesa anterior se hablaba de ese alineamiento, no solo de programas, de reglas de operación de cada uno de esos programas. ¿Sí? Cada programa tiene sus reglas de operación. En México, por ejemplo, está la Comisión Nacional Forestal, que es la que hace las actividades de reforestación. Bueno, y ella tiene sus reglas. Conagua tiene sus reglas. El Ministerio de Agricultura tiene sus reglas. Y muchos caemos en los mismos ejidos, en los mismos terrenos. Y mientras unos están apoyando o otorgando agroquímicos, otros están fomentando agricultura orgánica. Entonces, mientras unos fomentan reforestación, otros están fomentando cambio de uso de suelo. Entonces, hace falta trabajar mucho en nuestros gobiernos, pero yo creo que otra parte fundamental tiene que ver con los plazos y los periodos. Estos procesos hablo de adaptación y de estrategias de hacer frente a todo esto de cambio climático en diferentes frentes, salud, agricultura, recursos hídricos, tiene que ver con los tiempos de maduración. Tenemos que recortar los tiempos de resiliencia, eso me queda claro. Pero nuestros gobiernos, los locales son de 3 años, en México los estatales son de 6 años, los federales son de 6 años. Se hace planificación por periodos de retorno de 6 años, como decimos en hidrología, bueno, periodo de retorno. Entonces, creo que hace falta una visión de largo plazo, una visión holística y una visión de coordinación entre los diferentes ámbitos de nuestros gobiernos, el legislativo y lo que es el ejecutivo, o sea, el gabinete, el gobierno, y de ahí federal, estatal, municipal. Entonces, el desafío es grande, pero tenemos que hacerle frente a esto, ¿no? Hay experiencias en las comunidades, en los gobiernos, que necesitamos evaluarlos, pero necesitamos realmente a grandes problemas, grandes soluciones. A estos grandes problemas que tenemos en nuestros países, y hablo también por Centroamérica, de riesgos de inundación, de las pérdidas económicas que distorsionan el tejido social, económico. Estos grandes eventos rompen la economía de nuestros países, de hacerles frentes de otra forma, no nada más reconstruyendo lo que dañó la contingencia, sino hacernos más resistentes a eso. Entonces, tenemos mucho que trabajar, pero también tenemos un común denominador en nuestros países, ¿no? Pero hay que verlo de esa forma, o sea, entre gobiernos y entre instancias de gobierno.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the panelists? Sir.
Sí, le cuento que en Piura, en este año, ha aparecido una nueva epidemia, ¿no?, de este mosquito Aedes. Llevamos en este año 24 muertos y más de 6,000 infectados, ¿no? Estamos en emergencia. Consideramos que es parte del cambio climático la aparición de esta epidemia, que antes no la teníamos. Esto puede ayudar a tener un poco más de datos para tu investigación, pero también nos gustaría saber de otras experiencias mundiales en las que se ha podido combatir con eficiencia y eficacia esta epidemia.
La epidemia es de chikungunya, de Zika, de dengue, es de dengue. Porque todos los 3 son del mismo mosquito y todos están en las Américas en este momento y todo nos causa muchísimos problemas.
Sí.
Eficacia contra el Aedes aegypti. Lo que hay muchas experiencias, no sé si hay alguno que resale como el único manera realmente de hacerlo, porque no hay muchos que son exitosas. El Aedes aegypti es un mosquito de mucho adaptación a nuestro, el ser humano, nuestros ámbitos de vivir. Aedes aegypti antes fue considerado como un mosquito urbano. Ahora realmente vive por todos lados. No requiere agua limpia, puede muy bien vivir en agua sucia. No requiere mucha agua, puede vivir con la tapa de una botella, el agua que contiene adentro. Entonces es algo, realmente la única manera de combatirlo bien es con acción comunitaria, dando el énfasis que cada uno es responsable por su propio terreno, cada uno es responsable por mantener no solo limpio de basura, pero que los techos no almacenan agua en ciertas zonas por hojas de árboles, todas esas cosas, porque no requiere mucho agua. Entonces, es realmente la movilización social. En Cuba han hecho grandes esfuerzos, pero Cuba es una comunidad muy distinta a lo que el resto de las Américas y el Caribe tiene, pero es solo con eso de que cada uno tiene responsabilidad de mantener su propia área, de vigilar, de cada 5 días máximos ver andar caminando por el terreno, mirando que no hay agua almacenando en ningún sitio, porque hay químicos, pero los mosquitos desarrollan resistencia muy rápido a los diferentes químicos. No hay vacunas por el momento, entonces es realmente no dar donde vivir al mosquito, que requiere agua para 3 de sus 4 estados de vida. Entonces, realmente sacar el agua del círculo es la única manera de combatir al Aedes aegypti. Pero Bolivia también, ellos tienen muy buenos datos a la introducción de dengue a las diferentes zonas de Bolivia que generalmente fueron considerados demasiado alto para el dengue, pero ya hay. Entonces es algo en los Andes que se está viendo con mucha claridad que las enfermedades están subiendo a las alturas.
Thank you. Sir.
Gracias. José Luis, usted ha sido bastante elegante cuando ha mencionado el tema de la articulación a nivel tanto horizontal como a nivel vertical de las diferentes intervenciones. Y yo quería preguntarle específicamente sobre 2 temas que me parece que son claves cuando hablamos de implementar estrategias de gestión de riesgos o adaptación al cambio climático, que tiene que ver con corrupción y que tiene que ver con clientelaje político. Sobre todo cuando en los diferentes niveles de gobierno usted tiene representantes de distintos gobiernos, de distintos partidos políticos, ¿no? Y donde la articulación ya no es un tema solamente de voluntad política, sino se vuelve un tema de qué favor me dan. Y se lo menciono porque en Lima acabamos de pasar hace unos meses un problema de inundaciones en una zona donde todos sabemos que se inunda. El barrio se llama Huayco, que es deslizamiento. Ese barrio se llama así. Sin embargo, la municipalidad local ha seguido otorgando permisos para que se construya ahí. Y ese es el caudal de votos que tiene ese alcalde para reelegirse. Es un alcalde que creo, si no me equivoco, ha sido como 20 años reelegido alcalde. Entonces, ahí hay un elemento que más allá de que seamos conscientes de que haya ciencia, de que sepamos qué tenemos que hacer, hay un problema de clientelaje político muy serio que enfrentar y quisiera tener su reacción sobre eso, ¿no?
Sí, efectivamente, ¿no? Así como tú comentaste, ese caso en México fue muy visto, el caso de Villahermosa, en 2010, por ejemplo. Villahermosa está en la planicie del Golfo de México, es una ciudad muy grande en esa zona. La producción de petróleo se concentra mucho en esa zona. Está aguas abajo del sistema hidroeléctrico del río Grijalva, que tiene 4 de las grandes presas, que en conjunto abastecen como un 30% de la energía en el país. Entonces, bueno, se presentaron lluvias extremas muy fuertes en las cuencas altas y se tuvieron que aplicar los protocolos de operación de obras hidráulicas, ¿no? Y bueno, pues ahí había que balancear riesgos. Y efectivamente, pues se tuvo que desfogar presas por seguridad, porque así tiene que ser. Y pues sabíamos que tenía que inundar Villahermosa. La diferencia es que Villahermosa está en una planicie. Entonces, digamos que se inunda gradualmente y no sube mucho el tirante. Sin embargo, el impacto mediático y esta componente que comentas, que las áreas que sabemos per se que se inundan son las áreas donde están los fraccionamientos habitacionales que fueron promocionados por líderes que después buscaron escaños políticos. Ese es otro de los círculos viciosos que tenemos que romper en nuestros países. Y en la costa de Chiapas pasa lo mismo, llegan líderes promoviendo su carrera política, ofreciendo terrenos en época de secas, miren, terrenos, y en época de lluvia se inundan. Y entonces, cuando llegan a ser diputados o están en gobierno, bueno, pues ya legalizan esos terrenos y ya luego van con nosotros, Comisión de Agua, y nos dicen, tú eres gobierno federal, tú, gobierno federal, me diste estos terrenos, tú me los vas a sacar. No se pueden sacar. Entonces, realmente esa es nuestra realidad. Pero tenemos que buscar las formas de romper, como tú dices, tiene que ver con los aspectos éticos, son cuestiones éticas que tenemos que ver más allá de esa ambición política, ¿no? Y pues tenemos que hacer uso de esos mecanismos, ¿no? Es la vida humana y ante eso debemos de valorarla como tal, ¿no?
Okay. Thank you. Well, we are running a bit behind, so please approach any of the panelists at lunch or before. Lunch is downstairs on the 5th floor, quinto piso. Also, please leave your audio phones, your interpretation handsets on the table outside, and then pick them up on the way back. I believe the keynote, though, will be in English and not without simultaneous translation at lunch on the quinto piso, 5th floor.
No traigo muchos, pero les quiero obsequiar unos pequeños dípticos sobre lo que es vulnerabilidad. Entonces, bueno.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks.
Ay, perdón.